The neon red light of the Broken Spoke Saloon buzzed like an angry hornet against the twilight sky of Austin, Texas, fighting a losing battle against the encroaching shadows of a humid evening. The air was thick enough to chew on, smelling of asphalt, dry grass, and the distinct aroma of Lone Star beer spilling onto aged concrete. It was a sanctuary for the weary, and a cathedral for the faithful of country music, where the floors creaked with the ghosts of two-steppers past, and the walls held more secrets than a confessional booth. Parked in the far corner of the gravel lot, away from the prying eyes of tourists who came looking for a souvenir rather than a feeling, sat a black truck with tinted windows. Inside the cab, the air conditioning hummed a low, steady rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the man behind the wheel. George Strait sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the flickering sign of the honky-tonk. At 71 years old, the king of country looked every bit the legend the world believed him to be. But tonight the lines around his eyes were etched deeper, not by age but by a heavy burden that had settled in his chest like a stone in a muddy riverbed. He was not here for the applause or the cold beer or the familiar faces that would inevitably turn in awe if he walked through those swinging doors. He was here because of a letter that was currently folded neatly inside the pocket of his starch-pressed Wrangler shirt right over his heart. It was a letter from a man named Silas Miller, a third-generation rancher from just outside San Antonio, whose handwriting was shaky and whose words were desperate. Silas had written not to the celebrity, but to the cowboy, asking for nothing more than a prayer, because the bank was coming for the land his grandfather had bled for. George had read that letter 3 times. The first time he read it as a stranger, the second time he read it as a father, the third time he read it as a Texan, and that was why he was sitting outside the Broken Spoke, waiting for a meeting that was never supposed to be on the books. The passenger door opened, and a man slid in, bringing with him a gust of heat and the smell of cheap cologne that tried too hard to mask the scent of nervous sweat. It was Marcus Thorne, the promoter behind the upcoming Hearts of Texas benefit concert. Thorne was a man who smiled with his mouth but never with his eyes, a creature of contracts and percentages who looked at a guitar and saw a calculator. He adjusted his expensive Italian suit jacket, which looked ridiculous in the context of a Texas dive bar, and flashed a grin that was as bright as it was hollow. He held a tablet in his manicured hands, tapping the screen with an impatience that grated on George's nerves. George did not turn his head. He kept his gaze on the Broken Spoke sign, watching a moth throw itself repeatedly against the hot neon glass. He asked Thorne in a voice that was low and smooth, like gravel rolling under a tire, if the numbers for the charity fund were finalized. Thorne laughed a sound that lacked any genuine mirth and waved his hand dismissively, stating that everything was better than finalized. It was optimized. He claimed that the ticket sales for the NRG Arena show in Houston were breaking records and that the overhead costs were being managed with surgical precision. He told George that the Miller family and hundreds like them would be saved, and that George would be the hero on the white horse riding in to rescue the day. But George Strait had spent a lifetime looking at horses, and he knew when one was lame. There was a twitch in Thorne's jaw, a slight tremor in his hand, as he swiped through the digital graphs that set off an alarm bell in the back of George's mind. It was the same instinct that told a rider when a storm was coming, before the first cloud appeared on the horizon. George turned slowly to face the promoter, his blue eyes narrowing just a fraction. He asked Thorne specifically about the Direct Relief Fund, the account that was supposed to bypass the administrative fees and go straight to the families facing foreclosure. Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second, a microscopic pause that would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent decades reading crowds and emotions. Thorne cleared his throat and assured George that the Direct Relief Fund was fully liquid and ready for distribution the moment the last chord was struck on stage in Houston. George nodded slowly, but he did not smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded letter from Silas Miller, placing it on the dashboard between them. He told Thorne that he was going inside to meet Silas right now. He told Thorne that he was going to look a desperate man in the eye and promise him that help was coming. He warned the promoter with a quiet intensity that could freeze water that if he made a promise to a man like Silas Miller, he intended to keep it. Thorne's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes darting to the letter and then back to George's face. He stammered a reassurance, sweating visibly now, despite the air conditioning claiming that George had nothing to worry about and that the legacy was safe. George watched Thorne exit the truck and hurry toward his own luxury sedan, his steps quick and skittish like a cockroach caught in the kitchen light. George waited until the promoter's taillights disappeared down South Lamar Boulevard before he killed the engine. He sat in the silence for a long moment, letting the doubt swirl around him. He pulled out his phone, a device he used reluctantly, and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number saved simply as Old Red. Red was a man from a different lifetime, a former Texas Ranger who had traded his badge for a private investigator license and who knew the banking systems of the South better than he knew his own grandchildren. George typed a message, his thumbs moving deliberately over the screen. The message was short. It said simply, "Watch Marcus Thorne. Follow the money. I have a bad feeling." George stepped out of the truck, and the Texas heat wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. He adjusted his white cowboy hat, pulling the brim low, and walked toward the entrance of the Broken Spoke. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of sawdust. The band was playing a cover of a Bob Wills classic, and the shuffle of boots on the wooden floor provided a rhythmic heartbeat to the room. In a corner booth, sitting alone with a half-empty pitcher of beer, was Silas Miller. He looked exactly as George had imagined him, weathered and worn down like an old fence post that had weathered too many winters. Silas was staring into his glass as if the answers to his mortgage payments were floating in the amber liquid. When George approached the table, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas looked up and his eyes went wide, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. It was not just the shock of seeing a celebrity, it was the shock of seeing hope materialize in the form of a man in a button-down shirt. George sat down opposite him and extended a hand. Silas took it, and his grip was calloused and strong, the grip of a man who worked from sunrise to sunset. They did not speak of platinum records or sold-out stadiums. They spoke of rain. They spoke of the price of feed. They spoke of the ache in the bones when the norther blows in. George listened more than he talked. He heard the fear in Silas's voice when he spoke about his daughter who wanted to be a veterinarian, but might have to quit school to help pay the debts. George looked Silas in the eye and told him about the concert in Houston. He told him that the Hearts of Texas benefit was not just a show, but a mission. He gave Silas his word, the word of a Strait, that the check would be in his hand by Monday morning. Silas wept. He did not sob loudly, but tears tracked silently through the dust on his cheeks, and he nodded, unable to speak. That moment sealed it. The weight on George's shoulders doubled. He was no longer just a performer. He was a guarantor of survival. If Thorne was lying, if there was even a single penny missing from that fund, George knew he would be the one holding the smoking gun of betrayal. 3 days later, the backstage area of the NRG Arena in Houston was a chaotic hive of activity that would have overwhelmed a lesser man. Semis were unloading tons of equipment, roadies were shouting instructions over the roar of forklifts, and the smell of ozone and electricity filled the cavernous space. 80,000 souls were gathering outside the gates, a sea of cowboy hats and boots, ready to sing along to the soundtrack of their lives. George sat in his dressing room tuning his favorite guitar, a Gibson that had seen more miles than most long-haul truckers. The wood was warm against his chest, vibrating with each pluck of the strings. The door to his dressing room was open a crack, and through it he could hear the frantic energy of the production team. He heard Marcus Thorne's voice, loud and booming, bragging to a group of investors about the profit margins. George stopped tuning. He set the guitar down on its stand and walked to the door, standing in the shadows just out of sight. Thorne was on his phone, his back turned to the dressing room, pacing back and forth in the corridor. He was speaking in a hushed, hurried tone that was completely different from the bravado he displayed in public. George strained to hear his ears tuning out the background noise of the arena. Thorne said something about the Cayman Islands. He mentioned a shell company called Blue Star Holdings. He laughed a nervous, jittery sound and said that by the time the old man finishes singing Amarillo by morning, the wire transfer will be untraceable. The words hit George like a physical blow to the gut. The old man, the wire transfer, untraceable. The suspicion that had been a small flame at the Broken Spoke was now a raging inferno. Thorne was not just skimming off the top, he was gutting the fish. He was stealing the entire pot, leaving the Millers and every other family expecting help with nothing but empty promises and a concert t-shirt. George stepped back into his dressing room and closed the door softly. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt since his rodeo days before a particularly nasty bull. Rage, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. He looked at himself in the vanity mirror. The face staring back was calm, composed, the face of the king of country. But behind the blue eyes, a storm was brewing. He could walk out there right now and grab Thorne by the throat. He could call the police. He could cancel the show. But if he cancelled the show, the money that had already been collected might vanish into the legal limbo that Thorne had likely prepared for. If he confronted Thorne backstage, the Weasel might have a contingency plan, a way to spin the narrative or disappear before the handcuffs clicked. No, this had to be done differently. This had to be done the Texas way. Out in the open, under the lights, where there was nowhere to hide. George picked up his phone. It was an hour before showtime. He saw a message from old Red. It was a progress report. Red had found the link to Blue Star Holdings, but he needed more time to get the definitive proof, the digital paper trail that would stand up in a court of law and, more importantly, in the court of public opinion. Red said he was hacking into the encrypted server of the offshore bank and that he was close. He told George to go on stage. He told him to sing. He promised that if the proof existed, he would send it directly to George's phone the second he had it. George stared at the screen. He was about to walk out in front of 80,000 people and perform, knowing that the man organizing the event was robbing them blind. He had to maintain the charade. He had to smile and wave and sing about love and heartache while a crime was being committed in real time. He typed a reply to Red. "I am taking the phone on stage with me. Send it when you have it. Do not fail me." He put the phone in the pocket of his vest. It felt heavy, like a loaded weapon. There was a knock on the door and his tour manager poked his head in, letting him know it was 10 minutes to curtain. George stood up. He adjusted his belt buckle, checked the crease in his jeans and put on his hat. He walked out of the dressing room and into the hallway. He passed Marcus Thorne, who was standing near the stage entrance holding a glass of champagne. Thorne raised the glass in a toast, shouting over the noise that tonight they were making history. George stopped. He looked at Thorne with a gaze so piercing that the promoter actually took a step back, lowering his glass. George said nothing. He just tipped his hat and walked past him up the ramp toward the darkness of the stage wings. The roar of the crowd was deafening. It was a physical force, a wall of sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The lights went down and the arena plunged into darkness. A single spotlight hit center stage, illuminating the microphone stand and the stool. The announcer's voice boomed over the PA system, introducing the man who needed no introduction. George walked out. The noise levels spiked to a fever pitch. Flashbulbs popped like lightning storms in the stands. He waved, humble and gracious, acknowledging the love that washed over him. He picked up his guitar and sat on the stool. He placed his phone on the small table next to his water bottle face up. The concert began. For the first hour, George Strait was the consummate professional. He played the hits. He sang Check Yes or No, and the crowd sang every word back to him. He sang Troubadour, and men in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. But every time the lights dimmed between songs, George's eyes flicked to the phone on the table. It remained dark. The screen was a black void reflecting the stage lights. In the VIP box to the right of the stage, he could see Marcus Thorne. The promoter was laughing, shaking hands with local politicians, pointing at the stage as if he owned the man sitting on it. The sight made George's stomach turn. He thought of Silas Miller, who was likely listening to the concert on the radio in his truck, praying that this night would save his legacy. He thought of the betrayal, the audacity of it. To steal from the poor in the name of charity was a sin that George reckoned had a special place in hell reserved for it. He launched into a ballad, a slow, mournful song about lost love and regret. The arena was illuminated by thousands of cell phone lights, swaying like fireflies in the summer night. It was a beautiful sight, a manifestation of unity and shared emotion, and it was all based on a lie. George felt like a fraud. He was the distraction. He was the magician's assistant waving the red flag while the thief picked the audience's pockets. As the song ended, the applause was thunderous. George took a sip of water. His hand hovered over the phone. Still nothing. doubt began to creep in. What if Red couldn't find it? What if Thorne had covered his tracks too well? If the proof didn't come, George would have to finish the show smile for the cameras and watch Thorne walk away with millions. The thought was unbearable. He looked out at the front row. He saw a young couple holding a sign that read, "We love you, George, Texas strong." They looked like they had scraped together every dime they had to buy those tickets. They were the people Thorne was stealing from. George adjusted the microphone. He decided to stall. He began to tell a story to the audience, a story about growing up on a ranch, about the value of a handshake. He spoke slowly, his voice echoing through the massive space. He talked about honesty. He talked about how in Texas a man's word is his bond. The crowd cheered, appreciating the sentiment, unaware of the war raging inside the singer's mind. George looked up at the VIP box again. Thorne was not listening. He was looking at his own phone, typing furiously, a smug grin plastered on his face. George's heart rate spiked. Thorne was moving the money, right now. While George was talking about honor, Thorne was finalizing the theft. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. George finished his story and signaled the band for the next song. It was an upbeat number designed to get the crowd dancing. The fiddles kicked in and the energy in the room lifted. George played the rhythm guitar, his movements automatic, born of muscle memory. But his mind was entirely on the small black rectangle on the table. "Please, Red," he thought. "Come on, old friend." The song ended. The band transitioned into a soft instrumental interlude, giving George a moment to catch his breath. The stadium was awash in blue light. The atmosphere was serene, almost holy. George sat on the stool, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the table. And then it happened. The screen of the phone lit up. It was a blinding white light in the dim blue of the stage. A notification. It buzzed, vibrating against the wood of the table. The sound was inaudible to the crowd, but to George it sounded like a gunshot. He stopped playing. His hand froze on the neck of the guitar. The band, sensing something was wrong, faltered but kept playing a low loop. George reached out. His hand was steady now, the shaking gone. He picked up the phone. He unlocked it. There was a message from Old Red. Attached was a PDF file. The preview showed a bank transfer confirmation. The amount was staggering, $12 million, transferred from Hearts of Texas Foundation to Blue Star Holdings, Cayman Islands. The transfer had been completed 2 minutes ago. And then a second image. A photo taken by a private investigator in the Caymans, showing the registration documents of Blue Star Holdings. The owner's name was listed clearly in black and white. Marcus Thorne. George stared at the screen. The world around him seemed to vanish. The 80,000 screaming fans, the blinding lights, the music, it all fell away. All that was left was the cold, hard truth glowing in his hand. He looked up. He looked directly at the camera that was projecting his face onto the massive screens hanging above the stage. The audience saw the change instantly. They saw the warmth drain from his eyes, replaced by a cold, steely resolve that was terrifying to behold. The king of country was gone. The sheriff had arrived. George raised his hand and slashed it across his throat, a universal signal to the band. Cut it. The music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy, confused. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Was he sick? Was the show over? George did not put the phone away. He held it in his left hand like a badge of office. He pulled the microphone close to his lips. The sound of his breathing was amplified, echoing like a storm wind. He looked toward the side of the stage, toward the VIP box, where Marcus Thorne was now standing, frozen, his champagne glass halfway to his mouth, his smug smile beginning to crack. George spoke, and his voice was not the singing voice they knew. It was lower, rougher. "Folks," George said, his eyes never leaving the VIP box, "I've played a lot of shows in my life. I've seen a lot of things. But tonight I'm seeing something that makes me sick to my stomach." The crowd went deadly silent. You could hear a pin drop in the massive arena. "I need everyone to be quiet for a minute," George continued, his tone commanding absolute obedience, "because I just got a notification on my phone, and it seems we have a problem that music can't fix." The silence that fell over NRG Arena was heavier than the humid air outside. It was a physical weight pressing down on 80,000 chests, a collective holding of breath that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The feedback from the monitors hummed a low, lonely note, like a distant train whistle in the dead of night. George Strait sat on his stool, the neck of his guitar resting against his thigh, his left hand still clutching the phone that had just delivered the death warrant of a reputation. He looked out at the sea of faces, the darkness punctuated by the glow of cell phones and lighter flames, and felt a profound sadness wash over him. It was not the sadness of a song, but the deep, aching disappointment of a man who had believed in the goodness of people, only to be proven wrong by the greed of one. The notification on his screen had not just been numbers and bank codes, it was a betrayal of every handshake, every promise, and every hard-earned dollar that the people in this room had entrusted to him. George slowly placed the phone back on the small table next to his water bottle, but he did not turn the screen off. The light from the device cast an eerie upward glow on his face, shadowing his eyes under the brim of his hat, making him look less like a singer and more like a judge sitting at a high bench. He leaned into the microphone, the foam cover brushing against his lips. The sound of his breathing was the only thing audible in the massive stadium, a rhythmic rasp that echoed through the line arrays. "Folks," he began, his voice low and steady, devoid of the usual warmth that accompanied his stage banter. "I have always believed that a man is only as good as his word. My daddy taught me that on the ranch before I could even ride a horse. He told me that if you look a man in the eye and shake his hand, you are signing a contract that is more binding than any ink on paper." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd like dust after a stampede. In the front row, the young couple with the sign lowered it, slightly confused by the shift in tone. They sensed the danger in the air, the electricity of a storm about to break. "Tonight we gathered here for a cause," George continued, his eyes lifting, "to scan the VIP boxes on the right side of the stage. We came here to save the family farms, to keep the lights on in houses that have stood for generations, to make sure that good people like the Millers and the Johnsons and the Garcias don't lose the dirt under their boots because of bad luck and hard times. You all bought tickets, you bought t-shirts, you donated your hard-earned money because you trusted us, because you trusted me." He took the microphone off the stand and stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked to the edge of the stage, his boots echoing on the hollow wood. He stopped right at the lip of the platform, staring down into the darkness of the pit, where the security guards stood tense and alert. "But trust is a fragile thing," George said, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling like thunder. "It takes a lifetime to build and only a second to break. And right now, I am looking at a crack in the foundation that is wide enough to swallow this whole stadium." He turned his body fully toward the stage right wing where the VIP section was located. The spotlight followed him, cutting a swath through the darkness. High up in the luxury box, Marcus Thorne was still standing, frozen. The champagne glass in his hand tilted slightly, spilling a few drops of expensive liquid onto the carpet. He was smiling, but it was a rictus of fear, a mask that was slipping with every second of silence. He could see George looking at him. He could feel the eyes of 80,000 people following George's gaze, turning toward him like a tide. "I want to invite someone down to the stage," George said, his voice deceptively calm. "A man who has been instrumental in putting this whole night together. The man who told me that every single dime raised tonight would go directly to the families who need it most. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Texas welcome to Mr. Marcus Thorne, the director of the Hearts of Texas Foundation." The crowd hesitated. They clapped, but it was polite, confused applause. They did not understand the undercurrent of menace in George's voice. They thought this was a standard part of the show, a moment to thank the organizers. But Marcus Thorne knew better. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked for an exit, but the door to the VIP box was blocked by two large men in black t-shirts, members of George's personal security detail, who had moved into position silently while George was speaking. Thorne realized with a jolt of terror that he was trapped. He had no choice. If he ran, he would look guilty. If he went down there, he might be able to spin it. He was a salesman, after all. He could talk his way out of anything. Thorne straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and forced his smile back into place. He walked out of the box and down the stairs toward the stage entrance. The walk felt like a funeral march. The air in the backstage hallway was stifling. Roadies and technicians stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. Their eyes were cold. They sensed it too. The predator had become the prey. When Thorne emerged from the wings onto the main stage, the spotlight hit him with the force of a physical blow. He squinted, shielding his eyes against the glare. He walked toward George, his arms open wide, ready for a hug, ready to play the part of the benevolent philanthropist. George did not move. He did not open his arms. He stood still as a statue, his hand gripping the microphone, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. When Thorne got within 5 feet, George took a small step back, a subtle rejection that was amplified on the giant screens for everyone to see. Thorne's arms dropped awkwardly to his sides. He laughed nervously into the silence, a sound that grated on the ears. George leaned in. "Good evening, Marcus," he said. "Good evening, George," Thorne replied, his voice trembling slightly, as he was handed a wireless microphone by a stagehand, who immediately retreated into the shadows. "What a night, huh? Look at this crowd." "We did it, George. We really did it." "We did something all right," George said dryly. He gestured to the stool where his phone lay glowing. "Marcus, I was just telling these folks about the importance of a promise, about how when we say we are going to help people, we actually do it." "Absolutely," Thorne said, gaining a little confidence. "That is what tonight is all about. Helping the community, giving back. Every ticket sold is a lifeline, George. You are a hero for doing this." George did not blink. He walked over to the stool and picked up the phone again. He held it in his hand, weighing it as if it were a stone he was about to cast. "You know, Marcus, technology is a funny thing," George mused, looking at the device. "It connects us. It lets us share music, but it also leaves a trail, a digital footprint that is mighty hard to sweep away, even with a broom made of money." Thorne's smile faltered. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, glistening in the harsh stage light. "What do you mean, George?" he asked, his voice cracking. George unlocked the phone. He looked at the screen, then back at Thorne. "I got a notification right in the middle of the fireman. A message from an old friend of mine. He works in forensic accounting." "Do you know what forensic accounting is, Marcus?" The color drained from Thorne's face. He looked like a ghost in an Italian suit. I don't think this is the time for technical details, George. The fans want to hear music," he stammered, trying to deflect, trying to regain control of the narrative. "The music can wait." George roared, his voice suddenly exploding with power, causing the feedback to whine. "The truth cannot wait." The crowd gasped. The polite applause was gone, replaced by a stunned silence. People were standing up in their seats, craning their necks. The atmosphere had shifted from a concert to a courtroom. George looked down at the phone, reading from the PDF file that Old Red had sent. He spoke clearly, enunciating every syllable, ensuring that not a single person in the arena or watching the live stream at home missed a word. "Transaction number 4592 Alpha." George read, "Date, today. Time, 8:45 p.m. Origin account, Hearts of Texas Foundation Charity Liquidity Fund. Destination account, Blue Star Holdings. Location, Cayman Islands." He looked up at Thorne, whose knees were visibly shaking. Amount transferred, $12,400,000. The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. A collective gasp swept through the stadium, followed by a low rumble of anger that started in the nosebleed sections and rolled down like an avalanche. George took a step closer to Thorne, invading his personal space, towering over the smaller man. $12 million, Marcus. That is the entire gate. That is the merchandise sales. That is the donation bucket money. That is Silas Miller's farm. That is the roof over Mrs. Johnson's head." Thorne backed away, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "George, please, there must be a mistake. It's a holding account. It's for tax purposes. You don't understand how these things work. It's complicated." "Complicated?" George asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Stealing is not complicated, Marcus. It is the oldest sin in the book. You looked me in the eye in my truck outside the Broken Spoke. You looked Silas Miller in the eye, and you lied. You didn't just lie to me. You lied to Texas." The rumble in the crowd grew to a roar. Boos began to rain down, mixed with shouts of thief and coward. A beer cup was thrown from the pit landing near Thorne's feet, splashing amber liquid onto his polished shoes. George raised his hand, and the crowd quieted instantly, obeying the command of the man they respected. He wasn't done yet. He wanted to make sure there was no wiggle room, no loophole, no way for Thorne to spin this tomorrow in the press. "I have another document here," George said, scrolling down on his phone. "It is the incorporation paper for Blue Star Holdings. It lists the sole beneficiary and signatory. Would you like to guess whose name is on that paper, Marcus?" Thorne said nothing. He looked like he was about to vomit. He looked left and right, searching for salvation, but there was none. The band members behind him were standing up, glaring at him with undisguised contempt. The security guards at the edge of the stage had turned their backs to the crowd, facing inward, forming a wall. "It says Marcus Edward Thorne," George read. "Not a charity, not a non-profit, just you. You were going to take this money and fly away while these people lost their homes. You were going to let me stand up here and sing about heartache while you caused it." Thorne lunged. It was a desperate, foolish move born of panic. He reached for the microphone in George's hand, screaming, "It's a lie. He's lying. The documents are fake." George didn't flinch. He didn't even raise a hand to defend himself. He simply sidestepped with the grace of a matador, letting the bull rush past. Thorne stumbled, losing his balance, and fell to his knees on the hard stage floor. The microphone clattered from his hand, rolling away with a thud that echoed through the sound system. Thorne stayed on his knees, panting, his suit jacket torn at the shoulder, his dignity shattered. He looked up at George, tears of rage and fear streaming down his face. "You can't do this!" he screamed, his voice thin and shrill without the amplification. "I have lawyers. I have contracts. You are ruining everything." George looked down at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. He looked like a king looking at a court jester who had forgotten his place. "I didn't ruin anything, son," George said, his voice calm again, almost gentle, but with a core of steel. "You did this to yourself the moment you decided that your greed was more important than these people's lives. You forgot one thing about this state, Marcus. We don't take kindly to cattle rustlers, and that is exactly what you are, a rustler in a suit." George turned to the side of the stage and nodded. From the shadows, 4 uniformed officers from the Houston Police Department emerged. They didn't run. They walked with purpose, their badges glinting under the stage lights. They were led by a tall man in a Stetson hat, the chief of police himself, who had been waiting in the wings, alerted by George's team the moment the evidence had been verified. The crowd erupted. It was a primal sound, a release of tension and a cry for justice. 80,000 people cheered as the officers approached Thorne. They cheered not for a song, but for the truth. They watched as the officers pulled Thorne to his feet. They watched as his hands were pulled behind his back. They watched the glint of silver handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. Thorne was sobbing now, begging, pleading with the officers, pleading with George. "George, just help me. We can work this out. I'll give it back. I'll give it all back." "It's too late for that," George said into the microphone, his voice cutting through the cheers. "You can tell it to the judge, but as far as I am concerned, you are no longer welcome on this stage. Get him out of here." The officers marched Thorne away, dragging him toward the exit. The camera on the giant screen followed them, zooming in on Thorne's devastated face, capturing the moment of his total defeat. It was a live broadcast of karma in its purest form. As he disappeared into the wings, the cheering reached a crescendo, shaking the rafters of the arena. George stood alone on the stage again. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him tired. He looked at his phone one last time, then slipped it into his pocket. He picked up his guitar. He didn't play immediately. He waited until the officers were gone, until the energy in the room shifted from anger to triumph. He walked back to the microphone. He looked out at the audience, at the faces that were now looking at him, with a reverence that went beyond fandom. He had saved them. He had protected the flock. "I am sorry you had to see that, folks," George said, his voice weary. "I came here to play music, not to play sheriff, but sometimes the Lord puts you in a place where you have to do what is right, not what is easy." He paused, looking down at his boots. "That money," George said, pointing in the direction where Thorne had been taken, "that $12 million, it is gone for now. It is frozen in evidence. The lawyers and the bankers will fight over it for months, maybe years, and I know that Silas Miller and a lot of you out there don't have months, you don't have years. The bank comes on Monday morning." A hush fell over the crowd again. The reality of the situation set in. The villain was caught, but the money was still missing. The victory felt hollow. The farm was still in danger. George adjusted his hat. He strummed a G chord, the sound ringing out clear and true. "But I made a promise," he said. I sat in the broken spoke and I shook a man's hand. And like I said, a Strait never breaks a promise. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes blazing with intensity. So here is what is going to happen. I am going to finish this show. We are going to sing and we are going to dance, and tomorrow morning I am going to go to the bank. And I am going to write a check from my own account to cover every single cent that was stolen tonight. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. They were stunned. $12 million from his own pocket. No farm will be lost on my watch, George declared, his voice rising with emotion. Not one. If I have to sell every guitar I own, if I have to tour until I am 90, I will make sure that every family gets what they were promised. Because this is Texas, and we take care of our own. The explosion of noise that followed was unlike anything ever heard in NRG Arena. It wasn't just cheering. It was a roar of love, of gratitude, of absolute devotion. People were crying. Strangers were hugging each other in the aisles. The young couple in the front row was sobbing, holding each other tightly. George smiled for the first time that night, a real, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He signaled the band. Now he said, his voice warm and inviting, "I think we need a drink. Boys, kick it off." The band launched into the opening riff of Here for a Good Time. The energy was electric. The shadow was gone. The concert continued, but it was no longer just a concert. It was a celebration of survival, a testament to the fact that there were still heroes in the world. But as George played, as he sang the lyrics about living life to the fullest, his mind was already moving to the aftermath. Thorn was gone, but the rot went deep. There would be questions, there would be investigations, and somewhere out there in the dark, there might be others who were not happy that their scheme had been exposed. George knew the fight wasn't over, but for tonight, for these few hours, he would just be the guitar player. He would play until his fingers bled, if that's what it took to wash the stain of betrayal from this night. The final chord of the Cowboy Rides Away hung in the air of the NRG Arena, vibrating through the steel girders and the concrete foundation, a resonant hum that seemed to defy the laws of physics, refusing to fade into silence. George Strait stood center stage, his chest heaving slightly, not from the exertion of the performance, but from the sheer emotional gravity of the last 3 hours. He took off his hat and held it over his heart, bowing to the north, southeast, and west. The house lights came up, revealing 80,000 faces stained with tears and flushed with the kind of adrenaline that only comes from witnessing history. They weren't leaving. Usually at the end of a show, the rush for the parking lot begins before the artist has even left the stage, but tonight nobody moved. They stood rooted to their spots, witnessing the man who had just saved their community, not with a song but with a sacrifice. George waved one last time and walked up the ramp toward the darkness of the wings. As soon as he crossed the threshold out of the public eye, the facade dropped. He slumped slightly, his shoulders curling forward under the weight of the night. His tour manager was there instantly, handing him a towel and a bottle of water, but he didn't say a word. The entire backstage crew, usually a noisy, chaotic family of roadies and technicians, stood in a reverent silence, lining the hallway like an honor guard. They knew what had just happened. They knew that the check George had promised to write wasn't coming from a sponsor or an insurance policy. It was coming from the retirement fund. It was coming from the ranch. It was coming from the legacy he had built dollar by dollar over 40 years. George walked past them, nodding his thanks, his eyes tired but clear. He didn't go to the after-party. There would be no champagne tonight. He walked straight to the production office, a temporary room set up in the bowels of the arena where the air was cold and smelled of stale coffee and photocopier toner. Inside, the chief of police was waiting along with Old Red, who was sitting in a folding chair looking like a satisfied cat who had just eaten the canary. Red stood up as George entered. He didn't offer a handshake, he just tipped his battered Stetson. "You did good, George," Red said, his voice raspy from years of cigar smoke. "Thorn is in custody. The feds are already involved. They froze the Cayman accounts about 10 minutes ago." George sank into a chair and rubbed his face with his hands. "That's good, Red. That's real good. But frozen means stuck. Frozen means lawyers and red tape. It means that money won't be back in Texas for a long time." The chief of police nodded solemnly. "You are right, Mr. Strait. Federal asset forfeiture is a slow beast. It could take 6 months, maybe a year, before those funds are released back to the charity." George looked up, his blue eyes hardening. "Silas Miller doesn't have 6 months. The bank isn't going to wait for the FBI to finish their paperwork. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the same device that had delivered the notification that started this war. He dialed a number. It was late past midnight, but he knew the man on the other end would answer. It was his business manager, a man named Arthur, who lived in a high-rise in Dallas and watched George's finances like a hawk. Arthur answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "George, is everything okay? I saw the news. It's trending everywhere. They say you arrested the promoter on stage. I need you to do something for me, Arthur." George said, skipping the pleasantries. "First thing tomorrow morning, I need you to liquidate the investment accounts, the municipal bonds and the liquid savings." There was a silence on the other end, a silence so profound George could hear the hum of the server banks in the background. Arthur's voice came back shrill and panicked. "George, are you talking about the personal reserve? That's... George, that is over $12 million. If you pull that out now with the market penalties and the taxes..." "Just do it, Arthur." George cut him off. "But George, listen to me," Arthur pleaded. "You don't have to do this personally. We can issue a press release. We can explain that the funds were stolen. The banks will give the families an extension due to extenuating circumstances. You don't have to bleed for this." George leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Arthur, I didn't tell those people I would try. I told them I would do it. A press release doesn't pay a mortgage. An excuse doesn't keep a roof over a child's head. I want cashier's checks cut for every single beneficiary on the original list. I want them overnighted. I want Silas Miller to have his check by Tuesday morning. But the retirement..." Arthur started. "I can always sing more songs," George said softly. "I can always tour another year, but I can't buy back my name if I let it turn to mud. Do it, Arthur, or I'll find someone who will." He hung up the phone. The room was quiet. The chief of police looked at George with a mixture of disbelief and deep respect. Old Red just smiled a small, knowing smile. He knew George. He knew that this wasn't about money. It was about the code. The code of the West that said you ride for the brand and you protect the weak. The next 48 hours were a blur of logistics and lawyers. George didn't sleep. He stayed in Houston, meeting with the forensic accountants, ensuring that the list of victims was accurate, ensuring that no one was left out. He signed document after document, his hand cramping but his resolve never wavering. The news cycle was exploding. Every network from CNN to Fox was running the story. The king of country saves the day, the $12 million man. But George refused all interview requests. He wasn't doing this for the cameras. On Tuesday morning, the Texas sun rose hot and bright over the hill country, burning off the morning mist. George was back in his truck, driving down a caliche road just outside of San Antonio. The dust kicked up behind him in a golden cloud. On the passenger seat sat a simple white envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $350,000. It was the amount Silas Miller owed the bank, plus enough to cover operating costs for the next season. He pulled up to the Miller Ranch. It was a modest place, a single-story ranch house with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. But the fences were mended and the cattle in the pasture looked healthy. It was a home. Silas was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. He looked like a man waiting for the executioner. He hadn't heard the news about the personal bailout. He only knew that the charity money had been stolen, and he assumed that was the end of the line. George killed the engine and stepped out. The sound of the door closing made Silas jump. He looked up, squinting against the sun. When he saw who it was, he stood up, slowly dusting off his jeans. He looked tired, defeated. "Mr. Strait," Silas said, his voice cracking. I heard about what happened, about Thorne. I appreciate you trying. I really do. It's not your fault." George walked up the path, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked up the steps and stood in front of the rancher. He saw the fear in the man's eyes, the terror of losing his history. George reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the envelope. He held it out. Silas looked at it, confused. "What is this?" "It's the promise," George said simply. Silas took the envelope, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He opened it, tearing the paper. He pulled out the check. He stared at it. He stared at the numbers. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, thinking it was a hallucination brought on by stress. He looked up at George, his mouth open, but no words coming out. This is, Silas stammered. It's paid, George said. The bank is off your back, Silas. The land stays in the family. Silas fell to his knees. He didn't collapse, he just sank down, overcome by a wave of relief so powerful it buckled his legs. He clutched the check to his chest and sobbed. Great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. His wife came running out of the screen door, wiping her hands on an apron. When she saw her husband on the ground, she screamed, thinking he was having a heart attack. But then she saw George, and she saw the check, and she understood. She joined her husband on the floor, wrapping her arms around him, and they cried together, a mixture of grief released and future restored. George stood there, feeling like an intruder on a sacred moment. He tipped his hat, turning to leave. "Mr. Strait," Silas called out, struggling to his feet. "Wait, how can we ever... How can I thank you?" George stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "You can thank me by keeping those fences mended, Silas. You can thank me by raising your daughter to be that veterinarian she wants to be. You take care of the land, and the land will take care of you." "But the money," Silas said, wiping his face, "you shouldn't have to." George smiled, a sad, weary smile. "Money is just paper, Silas. It burns, it tears, it gets spent. But what you have here, this dirt, this family, that's the only thing that lasts. You keep it safe." He walked back to his truck and climbed in. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror. He saw Silas and his wife standing on the porch, holding each other, waving. They looked smaller now, dwarfed by the vastness of the Texas landscape, but they also looked stronger. They were rooted. Months passed. The seasons changed from the scorching heat of summer to the crisp brown of autumn. The scandal of Marcus Thorne played out in the courts exactly as George had predicted. Thorne was denied bail, his flight risk status, confirmed by the very documents George had read on stage. He turned on his accomplices, naming names in a desperate bid for a lighter sentence. The web of corruption unraveled, exposing a network of shell companies and dirty accountants. Thorne was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary, his reputation incinerated, his assets seized. But the world moved on. The news cycle found new tragedies and new heroes. The cameras stopped coming to the Broken Spoke. The internet chatter died down. But in the small towns of Texas, in the feed stores and the diners and the church pews, the story didn't fade. It grew. It became folklore. They told the story of the night the music stopped. The night George Strait stared down the devil and didn't blink. George was back on the road. The tour continued, not because he needed the applause, but because he had a hole in his bank account that needed filling. He played Tulsa. He played Oklahoma City. He played Wichita. And every night the crowds were bigger. They didn't just come to hear the songs anymore. They came to be in the presence of the man. They threw hats on stage. They held up signs that said simply, "Thank you." One night in late November, George was sitting in his dressing room in Fort Worth. It was quiet. He was restringing his guitar, the repetitive motion soothing his mind. His phone sat on the table. It buzzed. A notification. George froze for a second. The memory of that night in Houston was still fresh. He looked at the screen. It wasn't a message from Old Red. It wasn't a bank alert. It was a picture. It was a text from Silas Miller. The photo showed a young girl, Silas's daughter, standing in a white coat, holding a stethoscope, smiling broadly. She was standing in front of the sign for the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine. Underneath the photo was a caption. She got in. First semester starts in January. We couldn't have done it without you. George stared at the image. The lines around his eyes softened. The fatigue that had been clinging to his bones for months seemed to evaporate. He realized then that the $12 million hadn't been lost. It had been invested. It was invested in that smile. It was invested in the cattle that would be healed by those hands. It was invested in the future of a state he loved more than life itself. He put the phone down. He didn't need to reply. The picture was enough. He stood up and walked to the mirror. He adjusted his tie. He put on his jacket. He placed the white cowboy hat on his head, tilting it just so. He looked at his reflection. He was older. The hair was grayer. The eyes were a little sadder. But the man looking back was whole. He hadn't sold his soul. He hadn't compromised. In a world of notifications and digital noise, and fleeting viral moments, he had stood on a wooden stage and defended the ancient truths. The tour manager knocked on the door. 5 minutes, George, full house tonight. George grabbed his guitar. He walked out of the dressing room and down the long concrete hallway. He could hear the roar of the crowd growing louder with every step. It sounded like thunder, it sounded like home. He reached the side of the stage, the lights were down. The announcer's voice boomed, "Ladies and gentlemen, the king of country." George stepped into the spotlight. The noise was deafening, but as he looked out at the ocean of people, he didn't see customers. He didn't see fans. He saw neighbors. He saw families. He saw the people who made him who he was. He walked to the microphone. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't need it. He had his guitar, he had his voice, and he had his honor. He strummed the opening chord of Amarillo by Morning. The fiddle cried out sweet and high. George closed his eyes and began to sing, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just singing the words, he was living them. He was the cowboy riding away not from his problems, but toward the next horizon, knowing that whatever storms lay ahead, he would face them standing up, boots on the ground, eyes on the truth. The music swelled, filling the arena, filling the night, filling the hearts of everyone who heard it. And in that moment, amidst the melody and the cheers, the notification on the phone in the dressing room blinked once and then went dark. Its job done, its power broken by the enduring strength of a simple, honest man.